Murder in the Christmas Photo Studio. Welcome to Velvet Clues, dear listeners. I'm Connor, and tonight I bring you a tale of murder most festive, yet most foul. Before we begin, I wonder, do you still have those old Christmas portraits tucked away in albums? Those formal family photos with everyone in their Sunday best? Frozen smiles before painted backdrops? Share your memories in the comments below. Now, pour yourself something warm, settle into your favourite chair and let me tell you about the Christmas that changed everything for Miss Jane Marple. Chapter 1. The Portrait That Never Was. The December afternoon had arrived with unusual warmth for St Mary Mead, bringing with it a gentle mist that transformed the village into something from a Victorian Christmas card. Miss Jane Marple made her way along the high street, her basket containing several parcels wrapped in brown paper and string, when she noticed the new establishment that had opened where the old haberdashery once stood. Wickham's vintage Christmas portraits proclaimed the gilt lettering on the window, beneath which hung samples of sepia-toned photographs, showing families in elaborate Victorian costumes posed before painted winter scenes. The shop had opened just 3 weeks prior, and already Miss Marple had heard considerable discussion about Mr. Percival Wickham's remarkable ability to capture the essence of Christmases past. She paused to examine the display more closely, noting the exceptional quality of the portraits. Each photograph possessed a distinctive warmth and authenticity that seemed to transport the viewer back to simpler times. Children clutched wooden toys, mothers wore elegant bustles, and fathers stood proudly behind ornate chairs, all captured with remarkable clarity, despite the supposedly antique photographic process Mr. Wickham claimed to employ. It was while studying these images that Miss Marple became aware of raised voices from within the studio. The door stood slightly ajar, allowing the heated conversation to spill onto the quiet street. "This is absolutely outrageous," a woman's voice declared, sharp with indignation. "I paid £30 for an authentic vintage portrait, not some computer trickery." "Madam, I assure you there must be some misunderstanding," came a man's reply, presumably Mr. Wickham himself. His voice carried the practiced smoothness of someone accustomed to managing difficult clients. "Every portrait I create is crafted with meticulous attention to historical accuracy." "Historical accuracy?" The woman's laugh was bitter. "My daughter never wore that dress, never sat in that chair, never even entered your studio. Yet here she is in this photograph. Or rather, her face pasted onto some other child's body like a paper doll." Miss Marple found herself moving closer to the doorway, her natural curiosity aroused by this curious accusation. Through the gap, she could see a well-dressed woman of perhaps 40 years, holding what appeared to be a photograph in one trembling hand. Facing her stood Percival Wickham, a man of middle years with carefully waxed moustache and the theatrical bearing of someone who had perhaps spent time upon the stage. "Mrs. Hartwell, please," Mr. Wickham said, his composure beginning to fray at the edges. "You're quite mistaken. Your daughter Eleanor sat for me just last Tuesday. I remember it perfectly." "Tuesday?" Mrs. Hartwell's voice rose dangerously. "We were in London all of last week. My sister can verify this, as can the hotel where we stayed. How do you explain that, Mr. Wickham?" The photographer's face had grown noticeably pale beneath his carefully maintained tan. He opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again, apparently unable to formulate a suitable reply to this inconvenient fact. "I shall be consulting my solicitor," Mrs. Hartwell announced, sweeping toward the door with the photograph clutched as evidence. "This is fraud, pure and simple, and I intend to ensure everyone knows exactly what sort of business you're running here." She emerged from the studio with such force that she nearly collided with Miss Marple, who had not quite managed to step aside in time. "Oh, Miss Marple," Mrs. Hartwell exclaimed, her anger momentarily replaced by embarrassment. "I do apologize. I didn't see you there." "Quite all right, my dear," Miss Marple replied gently. "You seem terribly distressed. Is there anything I might do to help?" Mrs. Hartwell glanced back at the studio, where Mr. Wickham could be seen through the window, slumped in a chair with his head in his hands. "That man is a charlatan," she said firmly, "taking money for portraits he never actually creates. It's despicable, especially at Christmas when families treasure these memories." As Mrs. Hartwell departed, still clutching her evidence of deception, Miss Marple remained outside the studio, observing Mr. Wickham through the window. The photographer had risen from his chair and moved to an ornate cabinet, from which he extracted what appeared to be a glass of brandy. His hands shook as he raised it to his lips, and Miss Marple noticed how his eyes darted nervously toward the door, as though expecting further confrontation. There was something in his manner that spoke of more than mere embarrassment at being caught in a deception. Fear, Miss Marple thought, studying his pale features and trembling hands. But fear of what? Surely a fraudulent business practice, while serious, wouldn't warrant such obvious terror, unless, of course, there was more at stake than simply his professional reputation. Chapter 2. Flash powder and dark secrets. The following morning brought with it a crystalline frost that transformed St. Mary Mead into a scene worthy of Mr. Wickham's portraits, though Miss Marple reflected that authenticity in nature required no digital enhancement. She had risen early, as was her custom, and was tending to her correspondence when the telephone's shrill ring disturbed the peaceful morning. "Jane, my dear," came Dolly Bantry's breathless voice. "Have you heard? Something dreadful has happened at that new photography studio. The police are there now, and Dr. Haydock's car just arrived." Miss Marple set down her pen with careful deliberation. Experience had taught her that when Dr. Haydock was summoned alongside the police, the matter was invariably serious. "What sort of something, Dolly?" "Nobody seems quite certain, but Mrs. Price from the bakery says she heard an explosion just after 9 o'clock. She was opening her shop when it happened, rattled all her windows. And now they're saying Mr. Wickham is dead." The news, while shocking, did not entirely surprise Miss Marple. The fear she had observed in Percival Wickham's manner the previous afternoon had suggested someone who recognised danger approaching. She collected her coat and hat, pausing only to ensure her spare spectacles were secure in her handbag before making her way toward the high street. The scene that greeted her was one of controlled chaos. Police constables had cordoned off the area around Wickham's studio, while curious villagers gathered in small groups, exchanging theories and observations with the enthusiasm typical of those encountering genuine drama in their ordinarily peaceful lives. Inspector Slack's familiar figure could be seen through the studio window, his sharp features set in an expression of professional concentration. "Miss Marple," Dr. Haydock emerged from the studio, his usually cheerful demeanour replaced by grim seriousness. "I might have known you'd appear, though I'm afraid this is rather a nasty business." "Mr. Wickham is dead?" Miss Marple inquired, though the doctor's manner had already confirmed this fact. "Very much so," Dr. Haydock replied, lowering his voice. "The most extraordinary thing. He was preparing to take a photograph, using one of those old-fashioned cameras with the brass fittings and the black cloth. When he triggered the flash, the entire apparatus exploded. The force of it, well, let's just say the poor fellow didn't suffer." Miss Marple absorbed this information thoughtfully. "An accident with the flash powder, perhaps. I understand those old cameras used magnesium powder, which could be quite volatile." "That's what we thought initially," Dr. Haydock said. "But Inspector Slack has found evidence of tampering. The flash powder had been mixed with something considerably more explosive. This was no accident, Miss Marple. This was murder." Before Miss Marple could respond, a young woman emerged from the studio, her face streaked with tears and her hands wringing a handkerchief into increasingly smaller knots. She was perhaps 25, with auburn hair pulled back in a severe bun and clothing that suggested someone employed in a clerical capacity. "That's Miss Foster," Dr. Haydock explained quietly. "Mr. Wickham's assistant. She discovered the body when she arrived for work this morning. Poor girl's in quite a state." Miss Foster was being comforted by a police constable, but her distress was evident even from a distance. She kept repeating something about Christmas orders and disappointed families, her practical concerns mingling with shock in a manner that Miss Marple found entirely authentic. Inspector Slack appeared in the doorway, his expression sour as it always became when confronted with a murder in what he considered his peaceful jurisdiction. His eyes found Miss Marple immediately, and he approached with the resigned air of someone who had long ago accepted the inevitable. "Miss Marple," he said with barely concealed irritation, "I suppose you'll want to know all the details." "Only if you think it might be helpful, Inspector," Miss Marple replied mildly. "Though I did observe Mr. Wickham yesterday afternoon, and he seemed rather troubled." Slack's interest sharpened immediately. "Troubled? In what way?" Miss Marple recounted her observation of the confrontation between Mr. Wickham and Mrs. Hartwell, noting the photographer's extreme reaction to the accusation of fraud. Inspector Slack listened with growing interest, occasionally jotting notes in his official notebook. "Mrs. Hartwell, you say? We'll need to speak with her immediately." He paused, then added grudgingly, "That's useful information, Miss Marple, though I trust you'll leave the actual investigation to the professionals." As the inspector hurried away to organise the search for Mrs. Hartwell, Miss Marple noticed something that the officials seemed to have overlooked. Near the studio's rear entrance, partially hidden behind a dustbin, lay a small paper packet. Moving with the casual air of someone simply satisfying idle curiosity, she made her way to the spot and examined the packet more closely. It was a chemist's packet, the kind used for dispensing powders and medicines. The label was partially visible, though water damage had obscured much of the text. What remained clearly legible was a single word: magnesium. But it was the handwriting on the label that caught Miss Marple's attention. The letters were formed with distinctive loops and flourishes that seemed somehow familiar. She carefully picked up the packet using her handkerchief, noting its weight suggested it had recently contained a substantial quantity of powder. As she examined it more closely, she detected a faint but distinctive odour, one that reminded her of fireworks displays from her youth. "Found something interesting?" came a voice behind her, and Miss Marple turned to find Constable Edwards watching her with a mixture of respect and concern. "Perhaps," Miss Marple replied, offering him the packet. "This might warrant Inspector Slack's attention. It appears to be a chemist's packet that recently contained magnesium powder, though I suspect analysis might reveal traces of other substances as well." The constable accepted the evidence with appropriate gravity, though Miss Marple noticed his slight smile. The village police had long ago learned that Miss Marple's "perhaps" usually translated to "definitely," and her suggestions were ignored at their peril. As she prepared to leave the scene, Miss Marple observed Miss Foster being helped into a police car, presumably to provide a formal statement. The young woman's distress appeared genuine, but there was something in her manner, a certain watchfulness despite her tears, that suggested she was perhaps more aware of her surroundings than her emotional state might indicate. Chapter 3. The Camera's Hidden History. The interior of Wickham's vintage Christmas portraits revealed itself to be a curious mixture of authentic Victorian apparatus and decidedly modern technology. Miss Marple had managed, through gentle persuasion and Inspector Slack's grudging acceptance of her occasional usefulness, to gain access to the studio while the forensic examination continued. The explosion had left its mark dramatically across the main photography area. Pieces of brass and wood from the destroyed camera were embedded in the walls, while the painted backdrop of a Victorian Christmas scene bore scorch marks that created an oddly artistic effect against the peaceful winter landscape. The vintage camera itself, or what remained of it, sat twisted and broken on its wooden tripod, a testament to the violence of the blast that had claimed Percival Wickham's life. "Nasty business," Sergeant Lake observed, continuing his methodical documentation of the scene. "The flash tray was completely destroyed, but we found residue that confirms your suspicion, Miss Marple. The magnesium powder was mixed with potassium chlorate and sulphur, a combination that would create an explosion rather than a flash." Miss Marple studied the ruined camera with interest. Despite the damage, she could see it had been a beautiful piece of equipment, all polished brass and aged mahogany, the sort of camera that would have been used in prestigious studios during the Victorian era. "Mr. Wickham was very proud of that camera," Miss Foster said quietly from the doorway. She had returned after giving her statement, claiming she needed to collect personal items from her desk. Her eyes were still red-rimmed, but she had regained some composure. "He bought it at an estate auction in Hampshire. Said it had belonged to a famous Victorian photographer, though I never quite believed that story." "You worked closely with Mr. Wickham," Miss Marple observed gently. "You must have known about his photographic methods." Miss Foster's expression tightened slightly. "I knew he was talented with computers, if that's what you mean. But I did the bookkeeping, answered the telephone, scheduled appointments. The actual photography was his domain." Inspector Slack who had been examining papers on Wickham's desk, looked up sharply. Yet, you must have noticed that some clients came for sittings while others didn't. Mr. Wickham often worked irregular hours, Miss Foster replied carefully. He said artistic inspiration didn't follow a schedule. Some clients preferred evening appointments, others came when I wasn't here. I didn't question his methods. Miss Marple had moved to examine a shelf of photography chemicals and supplies, each bottle and packet meticulously labelled. The organisation spoke of someone who, despite his fraudulent business practices, maintained certain professional standards. Among the supplies, she noticed several packets of flash powder from different suppliers, each with slightly different formulations noted on the labels. He was quite particular about his chemicals, Miss Foster offered, following Miss Marple's gaze. Always said the quality of the flash affected the warmth of the image. He'd mix different powders to achieve specific effects, though I never understood the technical details. And who else would have known about these preferences? Miss Marple inquired. Several people, I suppose. Mr. Barnes from the chemist shop, who special-ordered supplies for him. Mrs. Hartwell certainly learned about them yesterday during their argument. She was quite vocal about his methods being fraudulent. And then there's Timothy Crane, the photographer from Lower Middleton. He and Mr. Wickham had quite a rivalry. Inspector Slack's interest was immediately aroused. Rivalry? What sort of rivalry? Miss Foster hesitated, then continued. Mr. Crane had been the only portrait photographer in the area for years. When Mr. Wickham opened his studio with all the vintage equipment and costumes, offering these elaborate Victorian sessions, well, Mr. Crane lost quite a bit of business. He came here several times, accusing Mr. Wickham of unfair competition. When was the last time Mr. Crane visited? Inspector Slack asked, his pencil poised over his notebook. 3 days ago, Tuesday afternoon. They had quite an argument. Mr. Crane said Mr. Wickham was making a mockery of real photography with his digital tricks. Mr. Wickham laughed at him, said he was just jealous because he couldn't adapt to modern times while maintaining vintage appeal. Miss Marple had discovered something interesting among the chemical supplies, a mortar and pestle with traces of white powder still clinging to its surface. She carefully avoided touching it, instead drawing Inspector Slack's attention to the find. He ground his own powder? Slack asked, examining the implement with interest. Sometimes, Miss Foster confirmed. He said commercially prepared flash powder was too uniform, too predictable. He wanted each portrait session to have its own unique quality of light. He'd spend hours experimenting with different mixtures. The inspector carefully bagged the mortar and pestle for analysis. Who else knew about these experiments? His special clients, mainly. The ones who paid premium prices for what he called museum-quality portraits. Mrs. Whitmore, Colonel Bradley, the Ashford family. He'd make quite a ceremony of mixing custom flash powder for their sessions, claimed it would capture their family's unique essence. Miss Marple noticed an appointment book on the desk, its pages open to the current week. Yesterday's date showed several cancelled appointments, each marked with a red X. Today's schedule showed a single entry. 9 km, test shots for Pemberton wedding. He was preparing for a wedding portrait, she asked. Miss Foster nodded sadly. The Pemberton girl is getting married on Saturday. They wanted Victorian-style portraits for the engagement announcement. Mr. Wickham was going to test his flash mixture this morning to ensure everything was perfect for their session tomorrow. So, whoever tampered with the flash powder knew he would be using it this morning, Inspector Slack observed grimly. But how could they know? Miss Foster protested. The appointment was only made yesterday afternoon after Mrs. Hartwell left. I took the call myself. Miss Marple studied the appointment book more carefully, noting the different handwriting styles for various entries. Most were in Miss Foster's neat script, but several, including some of the cancelled appointments, were in a bolder hand she presumed belonged to Mr. Wickham. These cancelled appointments, she said thoughtfully. When were they cancelled? Yesterday morning, before the studio opened. Mr. Wickham called each client personally, said he had a family emergency. But then he came in anyway, said the emergency had resolved itself. I thought it odd at the time, but didn't question it. The picture that was emerging grew increasingly complex. Mr. Wickham had cleared his schedule for the day, yet remained in his studio. He had been exposed as a fraud, yet continued preparing for future sessions, and someone had taken advantage of his methodical habits to ensure his death. Miss Foster, Miss Marple said gently. Was Mr. Wickham married? Did he have family? Divorced 3 years ago. His ex-wife lives in London now. No children. His only family was a sister in Scotland, but they hadn't spoken in years. He was quite alone, really. Perhaps that's why he spent so much time creating these elaborate fantasies for other families. There was something in Miss Foster's tone that suggested more than professional sympathy for her employer's loneliness. Miss Marple filed this observation away for future consideration, along with the growing list of those who had both motive and opportunity for murder. Chapter 4. Mothers Know Their Children. Mrs. Hartwell lived in a pleasant Georgian house on the outskirts of St. Mary Mead, the sort of residence that spoke of comfortable means without ostentatious display. Miss Marple accompanied Inspector Slack for the interview, her presence tolerated due to her discovery of the discarded chemical packet and her witness to the previous day's confrontation. The lady who received them in her morning room bore little resemblance to the furious woman who had stormed from Wickham's studio. Composed and carefully dressed in mourning colours, despite having no official connection to the deceased, Mrs. Hartwell offered tea with the practised grace of someone accustomed to managing difficult social situations. "I suppose you've come about Mr. Wickham," she said, pouring Earl Grey with a steady hand. "I heard about the accident this morning. Shocking, really, though I can't pretend to deep sorrow." "You argued with him yesterday," Inspector Slack stated, rather than asked, "about fraudulent photographs." Mrs. Hartwell's composure cracked slightly. "Fraudulent is precisely the word, Inspector. That man was a charlatan, taking advantage of families' desires to create lasting memories. Would you like to see the evidence?" Without waiting for a response, she produced a manila folder from a nearby writing desk. Inside were several documents. The controversial portrait of her daughter Eleanor, a receipt for £30, and most interestingly a series of printed emails between herself and someone identified only as Truthseeker 47. "I was contacted last week," Mrs. Hartwell explained, her fingers tracing the edges of the papers. "This person claimed to have proof that Mr. Wickham was perpetrating a fraud. At first, I dismissed it as jealousy from a competitor. But then, they sent me something that changed my mind." She extracted another photograph from the folder, this one clearly taken from a computer screen. It showed a digital workspace with multiple images of children's faces, separated from their bodies, ready to be inserted into pre-prepared portrait backgrounds. "My Eleanor's face was among them," Mrs. Hartwell continued, her voice hardening. "Stored on his computer like a paper doll, waiting to be dressed up in whatever costume would fetch the highest price. The anonymous informant showed me how to check the digital signatures on our portrait, proved it had never been taken by that antique camera at all." Miss Marple examined the evidence with careful attention. "How very thorough of your correspondent. Did they reveal their identity?" "Never. But they knew exactly how Mr. Wickham operated, down to the smallest detail. They even knew which computer program he used for the manipulations." "What did you do after confirming the fraud?" Inspector Slack asked. "I confronted him," as Miss Marple witnessed. "But that wasn't all." Mrs. Hartwell paused, seeming to weigh her words carefully. "I also reported him to trading standards yesterday evening. They were planning to investigate after Christmas." "Yesterday evening," Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. "What time would that have been?" "About 6 o'clock. After I left the studio, I went home and called immediately. Then I spent the rest of the evening researching consumer protection laws. My husband can confirm I was here all night." Inspector Slack made notes while Miss Marple studied the emails more carefully. The writing style was educated but careful, someone trying to disguise their natural voice. Certain phrases seemed familiar, though she couldn't quite place them. "Mrs. Hartwell," she said gently, "you mentioned your daughter was in London last week. Was this planned?" "My sister's birthday celebration. We stayed at the Savoy. Made quite a holiday of it. Eleanor loved the Christmas lights on Oxford Street." Mrs. Hartwell's expression softened momentarily. "That's what makes the fraud so particularly cruel. Mr. Wickham created this elaborate portrait of Eleanor at a time when I have documented proof she was 60 miles away." "Did you know any of Mr. Wickham's other clients?" Inspector Slack inquired. "Several. We're all part of the same social circle. Mrs. Whitmore was particularly taken with his work, had her entire family photographed last month, paid nearly £200 for a collection of portraits. Colonel Bradley commissioned a recreation of a Victorian military portrait. The Ashfords wanted something special for their golden anniversary. Miss Marple noticed a detail in one of the emails that caught her attention. The anonymous informant mentioned specific dates when certain fraudulent portraits were created. These dates your correspondent provides, they're very precise, almost as if someone was keeping records. Mrs. Hartwell nodded. I thought the same. It seemed like someone with inside knowledge, someone who had access to Mr. Wickham's appointment book and files. Miss Foster, Inspector Slack murmured, making another note. Or Mr. Crane, Mrs. Hartwell suggested. The other photographer. He certainly had motive enough, losing business to Mr. Wickham's elaborate deceptions. The interview continued for several more minutes, but Mrs. Hartwell had little more to add. She provided contact information for the Trading Standards Office and agreed to make her evidence available to the police. As they prepared to leave, Miss Marple turned back with one final question. Mrs. Hartwell, you're clearly an intelligent woman who researches thoroughly. Did you happen to investigate Mr. Wickham's background before commissioning the portrait? A slight flush coloured Mrs. Hartwell's cheeks. I'm ashamed to say I didn't. The studio looked so authentic, the samples so convincing, and several friends had recommended him highly. I let sentiment override sense, wanting that perfect Christmas portrait of Eleanor. And now, Miss Marple prompted gently, now I know he wasn't even properly trained as a photographer. Before coming to St. Mary Mead, he worked in theatrical properties, creating fake documents and photographs for stage productions. His entire business was built on illusion. As they departed, Miss Marple noticed a detail she had initially overlooked. On the hall table sat a small paper bag from Barnes's chemist shop, the receipt still attached. The date was yesterday, and among the items listed was magnesium sulfate, 100 green, for treating Mrs. Hartwell's garden plants. Outside, Inspector Slack was already planning his next moves. We'll need to trace this anonymous informant, and verify Mrs. Hartwell's alibi, of course, though she seems an unlikely murderer. Appearances can be deceiving, Inspector, Miss Marple observed. After all, Mr. Wickham built his entire business on that very principle. You suspect her? Slack asked with surprise. I suspect everyone, Inspector, until proven otherwise. But I am particularly interested in why someone would go to such lengths to expose Mr. Wickham's fraud just days before his death. The timing seems rather more than coincidental. As they walked back toward the village centre, Miss Marple noticed something else that intrigued her. In Mrs. Hartwell's garden, visible through the iron gates, were the remains of what appeared to be a recent bonfire. Among the ashes she glimpsed fragments of what might have been photographs, their edges curled and blackened, but still partially visible. Inspector, she said quietly, you might want to have someone examine what's been burned in Mrs. Hartwell's garden. It might prove illuminating. Slack followed her gaze and nodded grimly. I'll send Constable Edwards back immediately, though I do hope you're wrong about Mrs. Hartwell. She seems genuinely concerned about protecting other families from fraud. Indeed, Miss Marple agreed. A mother's protective instincts can be quite powerful. Sometimes powerful enough to drive them to extraordinary actions when their children are threatened or deceived. Chapter 5. The Chemist's Curious Knowledge. Barnes's chemist shop occupied a narrow building wedged between the milliners and the newsagents, its Victorian shopfront meticulously maintained with gilt lettering and glass bottles, filled with coloured liquids that had long since ceased to serve any purpose beyond decoration. Mr. Barnes himself was a man of precise habits and encyclopedic knowledge regarding the pharmaceutical needs of St. Mary Mead's residents. Miss Marple entered the shop to find Inspector Slack already engaged in questioning the elderly chemist, who stood behind his mahogany counter looking distinctly uncomfortable. The shop's interior smelled of carbolic soap and lavender, with undertones of more mysterious chemicals from the dispensary at the rear. I've already told you, Inspector, Mr. Barnes was saying, his fingers nervously adjusting his wire-rimmed spectacles. Mr. Wickham purchased flash powder components regularly, magnesium powder, potassium permanganate, sometimes special orders for more exotic chemicals. He was very particular about quality. And yesterday, Inspector Slack pressed, did anyone else purchase similar chemicals? Mr. Barnes consulted his ledger with the careful attention of someone who had maintained such records for 40 years. Mrs. Hartwell bought magnesium sulfate for her roses. Mr. Crane came in for developing chemicals. Miss Foster collected Mr. Wickham's standing order of magnesium powder, and young Tommy Morrison bought sulphur for his school chemistry project, though his mother had to sign for it. Miss Marple noticed several interesting details as Mr. Barnes spoke. Behind the counter, partially concealed by a curtain, she glimpsed what appeared to be photography equipment, including developing trays and bottles of fixing solution. "You develop photographs yourself, Mr. Barnes?" she inquired gently. The chemist coloured slightly. "A hobby of mine, Miss Marple. I've maintained a small darkroom in the basement for years. Traditional photography, you understand. None of this digital nonsense." "Then you would understand Mr. Wickham's techniques quite well," Inspector Slack observed. "Better than he did, frankly," Mr. Barnes replied with a touch of professional pride. The man knew computers, I'll grant him that, but his knowledge of actual photographic chemistry was superficial at best. He once asked me if he could create sepia toning with tea, as if 200 years of photographic science could be replaced with Earl Grey. "You disapproved of his methods?" Miss Marple asked. "I disapproved of his deception," Mr. Barnes corrected firmly. "Photography is an art, a science. What he did was closer to forgery, though I suppose there was skill in it, of a sort." The shop bell chimed, and Timothy Crane entered, stopping short when he saw the assembled company. The rival photographer was a thin, aesthetic-looking man in his 50s, with ink-stained fingers and the slightly distracted air of an artist. "Inspector," he said warily, "I heard about Wickham. I suppose you'll want to question me." "Your timing is convenient, Mr. Crane," Inspector Slack replied. "I understand you visited Mr. Wickham's studio on Tuesday." "I did," Crane admitted readily. "I wanted to propose a truce. The competition between us had become unprofessional. I suggested we might specialize in different areas, avoid direct competition." And his response. Crane's expression darkened. He laughed, said I should retire gracefully rather than embarrass myself trying to compete with progress. He showed me his computer setup, demonstrated how he could create a dozen portraits in the time it took me to properly compose a single shot. "That must have been frustrating," Miss Marple observed sympathetically. "Frustrating?" Crane laughed bitterly. "It was infuriating, but not enough to make me a murderer, if that's what you're thinking. I was at home all yesterday evening and this morning, developing photographs for the Pemberton wedding. Real photographs, taken with real cameras." Mr. Barnes had been following this exchange with interest. "The Pemberton wedding," he interjected. "But Mr. Wickham was handling their portraits. Miss Foster ordered special flash powder for it just yesterday." "They hired us both," Crane explained. "Me for the ceremony, Wickham for the formal portraits. Or rather, they had hired him. I suppose I'll need to handle both now." Miss Marple noticed Crane's camera bag, which he had set on the counter. A small packet protruded from a side pocket, its label partially visible. The handwriting on it was distinctive, with the same unusual loops and flourishes she had observed on the discarded packet near Wickham's studio. "Mr. Barnes," she said, "might I see how you label your chemical packets? I'm curious about your system." The chemist seemed puzzled, but complied, taking a blank packet and writing out a sample label. His handwriting was neat and precise, entirely different from what she had observed. "And do your assistants ever prepare packets?" she continued. "I have no assistants, Miss Marple. I prefer to handle all pharmaceutical preparations myself. The responsibility, you understand." Inspector Slack had been examining Crane's camera bag more closely. "Mr. Crane, this packet in your bag, where did you obtain it?" Crane looked at it with apparent surprise. "That's not mine. I mean, it's in my bag, but I didn't put it there. Someone must have—" He stopped, realization dawning. "Yesterday, at Wickham's studio, I set my bag down while we argued. Someone could have placed it there then." "Convenient," Inspector Slack observed skeptically. Miss Marple had moved to examine the shop's poison register, which Mr. Barnes was legally required to maintain. The entries were meticulous, recording every purchase of controlled substances. She noticed that several recent entries had been made in different ink, as though added after the fact. "Mr. Barnes," she said carefully, These entries from last week seem to have been added at different times. The chemist examined his own register with evident distress. That's impossible. I make entries immediately at the point of sale. Always have done. He studied the suspect entries more closely. These aren't my writing. Someone's been adding false entries to my register. Who has access to this register? Inspector Slack demanded. It's kept under the counter, but the shop is open to anyone during business hours. If I was in the dispensary or the stockroom, someone could have written in it without my knowledge. The picture was becoming increasingly complex. Someone had been establishing false trails, creating evidence that pointed in multiple directions. Miss Marple recognised the hallmarks of a carefully planned crime, one where the perpetrator had anticipated investigation and prepared accordingly. "Tell me, Mr. Barnes," she said thoughtfully, "in your professional opinion, what would happen if someone mixed magnesium powder with potassium chlorate and sulphur?" The chemist's face paled. That would create a highly unstable mixture. The slightest spark would cause a violent explosion. It's similar to the formula for certain fireworks, but much more volatile. Anyone with basic chemistry knowledge would understand the danger. "Or anyone with access to the right books," Miss Marple observed, glancing at the shelf of reference works behind the counter. "Your professional library is quite comprehensive." "Those books are for my use only," Mr. Barnes protested, "though I suppose someone could have consulted them while I was occupied elsewhere." The investigation had revealed a web of interconnected knowledge and opportunity. Multiple people had access to the necessary chemicals, several understood the required chemistry, and many had motive to wish Percival Wickham ill. Yet Miss Marple sensed they were still missing a crucial piece of the puzzle. Chapter 6. Behind the Painted Backdrop. The painted backdrops in Wickham's studio told their own story of deception. Miss Marple had returned to the scene with Inspector Slack's reluctant permission, drawn by a nagging sense that something significant had been overlooked. While the forensic team had completed their work, the studio remained sealed, its Victorian Christmas scene now bearing the scars of violence. Miss Marple carefully examined each backdrop, stored on large rollers like theatrical scenery. There were dozens: Victorian parlours, country gardens, military scenes, even an elaborate recreation of a railway platform complete with painted steam engine. Each was executed with remarkable skill, suggesting professional theatrical training. Behind the last backdrop she discovered something interesting: a small notebook wedged between the roller and the wall. Its pages were filled with what appeared to be a client list, but the entries were strange, consisting of initials, dates and cryptic notations. E.H. November 15th, completed, file. 47. G.W. November 8th, composite, file 31. M.A. October 27, original, destroyed. That last entry caught her attention. Why would Wickham destroy an original photograph, unless it contained something incriminating or dangerous? She continued reading, finding more entries marked destroyed, always originals rather than composites. Inspector Slack arrived with news from his investigation. Mrs. Hartwell's alibi is solid. Her husband confirms she was home all evening, and the neighbours saw lights in their windows. Also, the bonfire in her garden contained only personal documents related to her complaint against Wickham. "What about Miss Foster?" Miss Marple inquired, still studying the notebook. "More interesting there. She lied about not understanding Wickham's methods. Her previous employer, a London design firm, confirms she's skilled in digital image manipulation. She was dismissed for using company resources for personal projects." This information cast new light on the assistant's role. Miss Foster emerged from the afternoon shadows where she had been waiting, apparently having followed them to the studio. "I can explain," she said quickly, her composure cracking. "Yes, I knew about the fraud. Yes, I have the skills to help, but I needed this job. Do you know how hard it is to find work with a dismissal on your record?" "So, you helped him create the fake portraits?" Inspector Slack pressed. "No, he did those himself. I kept quiet. And sometimes I improved the final images, made them more convincing. He paid me extra for my silence and my skills." Miss Marple showed her the notebook. "Can you explain these entries?" Miss Foster examined the pages with evident familiarity. This was his real record. The official appointment book was for show. These are the actual portraits, whether taken or created. The destroyed ones were photographs where something went wrong. What sort of something? Miss Marple asked gently. Usually when he accidentally captured something that would reveal the deception. Reflections of modern equipment in mirrors, his computer screen visible in a window, that sort of thing. He was paranoid about leaving evidence. Yet, someone found evidence to send to Mrs. Hartwell, Inspector Slack observed. Miss Foster's expression shifted. That was me, she admitted quietly. I sent those anonymous emails. I couldn't stand the deception anymore, especially when I saw how much families were paying. Mrs. Hartwell's daughter reminded me of my own niece. It felt too personal. You betrayed your employer? Slack's tone was sharp. I tried to make him stop first. Told him it would end badly. He laughed, said no one would believe the truth even if it came out. People wanted the fantasy more than reality. Miss Marple had discovered another section of the notebook, this one containing chemical formulas and mixture ratios. The handwriting was different here, more precise and scientific. These formulas, she said, showing them to Miss Foster. Did Mr. Wickham write these? No, those appeared about a week ago. He found them slipped under the studio door one morning. He was delighted, said someone was helping him perfect his flash powder techniques. He tried several of the formulas, said they produced beautiful effects. Did he keep the original paper? Inspector Slack asked urgently. I think so. He filed everything. Miss Foster moved to a filing cabinet, searching through folders until she found what she sought. Here, the original message. The paper was ordinary notepad stock, but the handwriting was distinctive. More importantly, it carried a watermark visible when held to the light. St. Mary Mead Grammar School. The Morrison boy, Inspector Slack said immediately. He bought sulphur for a chemistry project. But Miss Marple was studying the formulas more carefully. They were sophisticated, showing deep understanding of chemical interactions. Too advanced for a schoolboy, even a clever one. Inspector, she said thoughtfully, I think we should speak with Tommy Morrison's chemistry teacher. These formulas suggest someone with formal training in chemistry. Dr. Patricia Morrison, Miss Foster supplied. Tommy's mother. She teaches chemistry at the school. Wickham photographed their family last month. The connection sent a chill through the room. Dr. Morrison had both the knowledge and access to create the deadly mixture. But what would be her motive? Miss Foster suddenly gasped. The Morrison portrait. It was one mark destroyed in the notebook. Something went wrong with their session. She searched through the files, finally producing a folder marked with the Morrison name. Inside were contact sheets showing multiple shots from their session. In several, young Tommy Morrison appeared distressed, even crying, despite the formal Victorian setting. Mr. Wickham insisted on absolute stillness for authenticity, Miss Foster explained. Some children found it difficult. Tommy was particularly upset. His mother was furious when she saw him crying. But she paid for the portraits, Inspector Slack asked. No, Wickham refused payment. Said he'd redo them for free, but Dr. Morrison never brought Tommy back. And then... Then what? Miss Marple prompted. About 2 weeks ago she came here, late, after closing. I saw her leaving as I arrived to collect something I'd forgotten. Wickham seemed shaken afterward, wouldn't say what they'd discussed. The threads were coming together, forming a pattern of maternal protection and revenge. A mother discovering her child's distress, investigating further, perhaps uncovering the fraud, and having the knowledge to do something about it. We need to find Dr. Morrison immediately, Inspector Slack declared. If she's responsible for this, she's had plenty of time to dispose of evidence. But Miss Marple was looking at something else in the contact sheets. In the background of one photo, partially visible in a mirror's reflection, was another child's face. A face that looked remarkably like Eleanor Hartwell, though the photo was dated weeks before Eleanor's portrait was supposedly taken. Inspector, she said quietly, I think the situation is more complex than we imagined. Chapter 7. The Truth in Silver Gelatin. Dr. Patricia Morrison's laboratory at St. Mary Mead Grammar School was a testament to methodical organisation. Every beaker, every compound, every piece of equipment had its designated place. The woman herself stood calmly beside the periodic table, showing no surprise at the arrival of Inspector Slack and Miss Marple. I've been expecting you, she said simply, her voice carrying the measured tones of someone accustomed to lecturing. Since I heard about Mr. Wickham's death, I knew you would eventually trace the formulas to someone with proper chemistry knowledge. Then you admit to providing those formulas? Inspector Slack asked, his hand moving to his handcuffs. I provided formulas, yes, but not for the mixture that killed him. Dr. Morrison moved to her desk, producing a folder of papers. These are copies of what I gave Mr. Wickham. Flash powder formulas that would have produced superior photographic effects. Nothing more dangerous than what photographers used in the 1890s. Miss Marple examined the papers carefully. The formulas were indeed different from what they had found in Wickham's studio, though the handwriting was similar. Someone altered your formulas, she observed. Changed the proportions, added components that would make them lethal. Precisely, Dr. Morrison agreed. I wanted to help him improve his craft, despite our previous disagreement. I thought if he could create better actual photographs, he might rely less on digital manipulation. Tell us about the disagreement, Inspector Slack requested. Dr. Morrison's composed facade cracked slightly. He traumatized my son. Tommy has anxiety issues, and Wickham's insistence on absolute stillness for extended periods triggered a panic attack. When I saw the contact sheets, saw my child's distress being captured for Wickham's art, I was furious. Furious enough to kill, Slack pressed. Furious enough to investigate, she corrected. I started examining his techniques, his chemicals, his entire operation. That's when I discovered the fraud, but I also discovered something else. She produced another folder, this one containing what appeared to be genuine vintage photographs. These are real Victorian portraits from the 1880s. I found them in an antique shop in London. Look carefully at the photographer's mark in the corner. Miss Marple studied the images through her magnifying glass. The photographer's mark read, A. Wickham and Sons, established 1875. Percival Wickham's great-grandfather, Dr. Morrison explained. He really did come from a family of photographers. I think he started this business trying to honour that heritage, but lacking the patience for traditional methods, he turned to digital shortcuts. That doesn't explain who killed him, Inspector Slack said impatiently. No, but this might. Dr. Morrison produced a final item, a school exercise book with Tommy's name on the cover. My son brought this home yesterday. He said Miss Foster gave it to him when he went to the studio after school to apologise for crying during the photo session. The exercise book contained chemistry notes, but several pages had been torn out. The remaining pages showed impressions from writing on the removed sheets. Miss Marple held the book to the light, able to make out some of the impressed writing. It appeared to be calculations for chemical mixtures, including the fatal combination that had killed Wickham. Miss Foster studied chemistry at A-levels, Dr. Morrison continued. She would have had enough knowledge to alter my formulas, and as Wickham's assistant, she had complete access to his supplies. But why would she kill him? Inspector Slack wondered. She admitted to exposing his fraud, but murder? Miss Marple had been unusually quiet, studying all the evidence before her. Finally she spoke. Inspector, I think we need to return to the studio. There's something about those destroyed photographs that we haven't fully understood. The group returned to Wickham's studio, where Miss Marple directed them to the filing cabinet containing the destroyed images. She spread them out on the table, examining each one, with meticulous care. Look at the dates, she said. All of these destroyed photographs were taken on specific days when Miss Foster was supposedly absent from the studio. So, Inspector Slack asked, don't you see? These are the only genuine photographs Wickham took, the ones where he actually used his antique camera. He destroyed them not because they revealed modern equipment, but because they would prove he could take real photographs when Miss Foster wasn't there to witness it. The implication was clear. Wickham had been maintaining the fraud even with his assistant, letting her believe he was incapable of traditional photography while secretly practicing his hereditary craft. He was protecting something, Miss Marple continued. Or someone. She turned to one particular photograph, holding it to the light. In the background, barely visible, was a figure in the doorway. The face was obscured, but the clothing was distinctive, the uniform of a prison officer. Inspector, Miss Marple said quietly, I think we need to investigate whether anyone connected to this case has a relative in prison or recently released. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. The murder was connected to something larger than professional jealousy or exposed fraud. There were secrets here that someone had killed to protect. Dr. Morrison suddenly spoke. My brother was in prison, released 6 months ago, but he has nothing to do with this. What was he imprisoned for? Inspector Slack asked. Fraud. Digital manipulation of financial documents. Her voice was barely audible. He's a computer expert, like Miss Foster. The connections were multiplying, creating a web of relationships and motives that grew more complex with each revelation. Miss Marple sensed they were close to the truth, but crucial pieces still remained hidden. Chapter 8. Developing in Darkness. The basement darkroom of Barnes's chemist shop was a world frozen in time. Red lights cast an eerie glow over developing trays and enlargers that had been in use since the 1960s. Miss Marple descended the narrow stairs carefully, followed by Inspector Slack and a very nervous Mr. Barnes. I don't understand why you need to see this, the chemist protested. It's just my private darkroom for personal photography. Miss Marple examined the space with interest. Strips of developed film hung from clips along one wall, while bottles of developing chemicals lined shelves with obsessive precision. But it was the photographs floating in the developing tray that caught her attention. Mr. Barnes, she said gently, these photographs are of Wickham's studio, taken recently, judging by the Christmas decorations. The chemist's composure crumbled. I can explain. I was documenting his fraud. Real photographers have a responsibility to expose charlatans. Inspector Slack examined the photographs more closely. They showed Wickham at his computer, clearly manipulating digital images. Others showed him meeting with various clients, including some taken through the studio windows at night. You've been stalking him, Slack accused. Investigating, Barnes corrected. There's a difference. I knew something was wrong with his operation. The chemicals he ordered didn't match the work he claimed to be doing. Miss Marple noticed something else. A series of photographs showing Miss Foster entering and leaving the studio at unusual hours, often carrying boxes or bags. You were watching Miss Foster too, she observed. She was removing things from the studio, original photographs, negatives, equipment. I thought she was stealing from him. But now... Barnes paused, realization dawning. She was protecting evidence of the genuine photographs. Or destroying evidence, Inspector Slack suggested. Miss Marple had moved to examine the developing chemicals. One bottle caught her attention. Potassium chlorate, clearly labelled and recently opened. Mr. Barnes, you have all the components here to create the explosive mixture that killed Mr. Wickham. Every photography darkroom has dangerous chemicals, Barnes protested. That doesn't make me a murderer. No, Miss Marple agreed, but it makes you capable of murder. The question is whether you had sufficient motive. Barnes sank onto a stool, suddenly looking his age. Wickham was destroying the reputation of photography in this village. Real photography, the kind that captures truth rather than creating lies. My grandfather established this chemist shop to serve photographers. We've been supplying them for 3 generations. And Wickham represented everything you despised about modern methods, Miss Marple said sympathetically. He could have been great, Barnes said bitterly. I've seen the work his great-grandfather did. There's one of his photographs upstairs, a portrait of my own grandfather. Percival had that talent in his blood, but he chose the easy path. Inspector Slack had been examining more photographs and suddenly held one up. Mr. Barnes, this photograph shows someone entering your shop after hours. Someone with a key. The image was dark, but clear enough to show a figure unlocking the rear entrance to the chemist shop. The timestamp showed 2 a.m., 3 nights before Wickham's death. Barnes studied the photograph with genuine surprise. That's not possible. Only I have keys to that door. Miss Marple examined the photograph more carefully. The figure was wearing a distinctive coat, one she had seen recently. Inspector, she said, I believe that's Dr. Morrison's coat, the one with the unusual button pattern. But she doesn't have keys to my shop, Barnes insisted. No, Miss Marple agreed, but her brother might. You mentioned he was recently released from prison. What you didn't mention, Mr. Barnes, is that before his imprisonment, David Morrison worked as a locksmith. The revelation sent Inspector Slack hurrying to his radio to call for additional officers. While he coordinated the Search for David Morrison. Miss Marple continued examining the darkroom. Behind the enlarger, she found a box of old photographs, some dating back decades. Among them was a formal portrait of two young men standing before a photography studio. The sign above the door read, "Wickham and Barnes, Portrait Photographers." "Your grandfather and Wickham's great-grandfather were partners," she said softly. Barnes nodded reluctantly. "Until Wickham's ancestor bought out my grandfather's share for a pittance during the Depression. My family never forgave that betrayal. When Percival came here, opening his studio with his family name so prominently displayed, it felt like salt in an old wound." "Old wounds can fester," Miss Marple observed. "Sometimes they drive people to extreme actions." "I wanted to expose him, not kill him," Barnes insisted. "These photographs were to be my evidence when I reported him to the authorities." Inspector Slack returned from his radio call. "David Morrison hasn't been seen for 2 days. His sister claims she doesn't know where he is." "She's protecting him," Miss Marple said, "just as Miss Foster was protecting someone. The question is, who was each of them protecting, and why?" She turned back to the photographs in the developing tray. One showed Wickham meeting with a man whose face was obscured by shadow. The timestamp was the night before his death. "Mr. Barnes, do you have the negative for this photograph?" Barnes retrieved the negative strip, and Miss Marple held it to the light. With better contrast, the man's features were clearer. It was David Morrison, and he was handing Wickham what appeared to be a thick envelope. "Blackmail," Inspector Slack concluded. Morrison was blackmailing Wickham. "Or being blackmailed by him," Miss Marple suggested. Mr. Wickham knew about past crimes, after all. Digital fraud would be very interesting to someone who practiced it himself. The web of connections grew ever more complex. Family histories, old betrayals, modern crimes, and protective instincts all intertwined around the central tragedy of Percival Wickham's death. Chapter 9. The Negative Truth. The confrontation took place in Wickham's studio, with all the principal figures assembled like actors in the final scene of a play. David Morrison had been found hiding in his sister's garden shed, and now sat handcuffed between two constables. Miss Foster was present, as were Mr. Barnes, Dr. Patricia Morrison, Mrs. Hartwell, and Timothy Crane. Miss Marple stood before the damaged backdrop, the explosion's scars serving as a grim reminder of the violence that had occurred here. Inspector Slack watched from his position by the door, allowing her to orchestrate this denouement. "The truth about Mr. Wickham's death," she began, "lies not in what we can see, but in what was meant to remain hidden. Like a photographic negative, we must invert our assumptions to see the real picture." She turned first to David Morrison. "You came here to destroy evidence of your own crimes. Mr. Wickham had discovered your connection to a series of digital frauds committed before your imprisonment. He had proof that could send you back to prison." David Morrison's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. "Your sister, Dr. Morrison, discovered your visit here. She tried to protect you by providing those chemical formulas, hoping to give you a way to destroy evidence without violence, but someone altered those formulas." "I didn't alter them," David protested, speaking for the first time. "I gave them to Wickham exactly as Patricia wrote them." "No," Miss Marple said gently. "You gave them to someone else first, someone who promised to help you deal with Wickham permanently." She turned to Miss Foster. "You were protecting David Morrison. You were in love with him, weren't you? You met when he came to threaten Wickham, and you saw a kindred spirit, someone else whose life had been damaged by digital crimes." Miss Foster's eyes filled with tears. "David didn't deserve to go back to prison. He'd served his time, but Wickham was going to expose him, claim the reward for information about the remaining digital frauds." "So you altered the formulas," Inspector Slack said. "You murdered Wickham to protect Morrison." "No," Miss Foster cried. "I altered them, yes, but only to make them ineffective. I wanted Wickham's photography to fail, to embarrass him. I never meant for anyone to die." Miss Marple shook her head gently. "The formulas were altered twice, once by you to make them fail, and once by someone else to make them fatal." She moved to the damaged camera. "The killer needed Wickham to die in a way that would destroy evidence. An explosion would eliminate photographs, negatives, and digital files in the immediate vicinity. It was meant to look like an accident with volatile chemicals. "But who?" Inspector Slack demanded. Miss Marple turned to Timothy Crane. "You knew about the Morrison family connection, didn't you? You'd been investigating Wickham for months, trying to find leverage against your competitor." Crane shifted uncomfortably. "I knew he had something on David Morrison, yes. But I didn't kill him." "No," Miss Marple agreed, "but you provided information to someone who did." She finally turned to Mr. Barnes. "The Wickham-Barnes partnership that ended so bitterly generations ago. Your grandfather's photography business destroyed by that betrayal. You've spent years perfecting traditional photography while watching the craft corrupted by digital manipulation." "That doesn't make me a murderer," Barnes protested. "It does when you discover that Wickham possessed something precious, the original partnership documents from your grandfather's time, documents that proved your family was entitled to half the Wickham photography fortune." The room fell silent. Barnes's face had gone white. "Wickham found them in his great-grandfather's effects," Miss Marple continued. "He came to you that night, offering to sell them back. The envelope David Morrison delivered contained those documents. Wickham was collecting money from everyone, blackmailing David, selling documents to you, taking payments for fraudulent portraits." "You can't prove any of this," Barnes said weakly. "The proof is in your darkroom," Miss Marple replied. "Not just the photographs you took, but the chemicals you mixed. You see, when you created the explosive mixture, you added something distinctive, a specific brand of sulfur that you special order for your darkroom. The residue would be chemically traceable." Inspector Slack was already on his radio, ordering a forensic team to Barnes's shop. "But there's one more twist," Miss Marple said. "Mr. Barnes didn't work alone. He had an accomplice who actually placed the altered chemicals in Wickham's studio." She turned to Mrs. Hartwell. "You discovered your daughter's portrait was fake, yes, but you discovered something else in Wickham's files, evidence that your late husband had been involved in the digital frauds that sent David Morrison to prison." Mrs. Hartwell's composed facade finally cracked. "He had photographs, documents, proof that would have destroyed my husband's memory and my daughter's inheritance." "So you and Mr. Barnes conspired," Miss Marple concluded. "He provided the lethal mixture. You ensured it was in place for Wickham's morning appointment. You knew he always tested his flash powder before important sessions." "It was justice," Mrs. Hartwell said defiantly. "That man was a parasite, feeding off secrets and lies." "It was murder," Inspector Slack corrected, signalling his constables. As the arrests were made, Miss Marple reflected on the tragic waste of it all. Percival Wickham had possessed real talent, evidenced by the genuine photographs he'd hidden away. But his choice to take shortcuts, to build his business on deception, had created a web that ultimately ensnared him. "The saddest part," she told Inspector Slack, "is that if Wickham had simply been honest about his methods, charging fairly for digital portraits, he might still be alive." "Instead, he tried to be something he wasn't," Slack agreed. "No," Miss Marple corrected gently. "He tried not to be something he was, a talented photographer from a family of artists. In denying his true nature, he created the circumstances of his own destruction." Chapter 10. Christmas Morning. Revelations. Christmas morning dawned crisp and clear in St. Mary Mead, the winter sun casting long shadows across the frost-covered village green. Miss Marple sat in her parlour, contemplating the events of the past week while addressing Christmas cards that would now arrive fashionably late. The doorbell rang, and her maid showed in Inspector Slack, looking unusually cheerful for a man who had just concluded such a complex case. "Miss Marple, I thought you'd want to know the final details," he said, accepting a cup of tea and a mince pie. "That's very thoughtful of you. Inspector, I confess to some remaining curiosity about certain aspects of the case." Slack consulted his notebook. "Barnes and Mrs. Hartwell have both confessed. Barnes provided the explosive mixture, motivated by the discovery of those partnership documents and generations of resentment. Mrs. Hartwell placed it in the studio, desperate to prevent the exposure of her husband's criminal connections." "And the others?" "David Morrison is cooperating fully. He'll likely avoid prison given that he was being blackmailed. His sister, Dr. Morrison, genuinely only tried to help improve Wickham's legitimate photography. No charges there. What about Miss Foster? Miss Marple asked gently. That's more complicated. She admits to tampering with the formulas, but only to make them ineffective. She also admits to destroying evidence of Wickham's genuine photographs, claiming she was protecting his reputation, wanting people to remember him as either a complete fraud or a complete artist, not something in between. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. She loved David Morrison, but she also, in her way, loved Wickham, or at least the idea of what he could have been. Timothy Crane is clear, Slack continued. His rivalry was purely professional. He's actually asked to purchase some of Wickham's authentic equipment to preserve it as a memorial to traditional photography. How fitting, Miss Marple observed. And what of the studio itself? Here's the remarkable part. Wickham's will, which we found in his flat, leaves everything to establish a photography school for underprivileged children. He wrote that he wanted to give others the chance to learn the craft properly, the way he never did. Miss Marple smiled sadly. So he did understand the value of authentic artistry, even if he couldn't practice it himself. There's one more thing, Slack said, producing a package. We found this in Wickham's personal effects, addressed to you. Miss Marple opened the package carefully. Inside was a photograph, a genuine vintage portrait that showed exceptional skill and artistry. The subject was a young woman in Victorian dress, but the face was unmistakably Miss Marple herself, captured at a church charity event weeks ago when she hadn't noticed Wickham with his camera. The accompanying note read, "Dear Miss Marple, I observed you watching my studio with interest. This is my apology for the deception you surely detected. This portrait is genuine, created with my great-grandfather's techniques. Perhaps one honest photograph can begin to balance the ledger of my lies. Percival Wickham." He knew, Miss Marple said softly. He knew someone would discover his fraud, and he knew I was watching. Then why didn't he stop? Inspector Slack asked. Because by then he was trapped in his own web. The blackmail, the threats, the expectations. He couldn't find a way back to honesty that wouldn't destroy everything. They sat in companionable silence for a moment. The Christmas, bells beginning to ring from St. Mary Mead's church. What will happen to all the fraudulent portraits? Miss Marple asked. That's for the courts to decide, but Mrs. Hartwell has an interesting proposal. She suggests keeping them but labelling them honestly as digital art. She says her daughter actually prefers her fake portrait, because it shows her as she imagines herself, not as she necessarily is. How very modern, Miss Marple observed. Truth and fiction coexisting, each acknowledged for what it is. Inspector Slack rose to leave. Thank you, Miss Marple. Without your observations, we might never have uncovered the full truth. The truth was always there, Inspector, like an image on photographic paper, waiting for the right chemical reaction to make it visible. After the inspector departed, Miss Marple studied Wickham's photograph of her. It was remarkably good, capturing not just her physical appearance but something of her character, the sharp intelligence behind the gentle demeanour, the observer pretending to be merely observed. She placed the photograph on her mantel, a reminder that even in an age of digital deception, truth had a way of developing, given time and the right conditions. The church bells continued to ring, calling the village to Christmas service. Miss Marple collected her coat and hat, pausing to look once more at the photograph. "Rest in peace, Mr. Wickham," she said quietly. "Your last portrait, at least, was honest." As she walked toward the church, she noticed the photography studio stood empty, its windows dark, but affixed to the door was a new sign. Future home of the Wickham School of Traditional Photography, opening spring 1951. Miss Marple smiled. Sometimes, she reflected, truth emerged from deception like a photograph from a negative, reversed but ultimately clearer. And sometimes, just sometimes, tragedy could give birth to redemption. The Christmas service was beautiful, the village united in celebration despite recent events. As Miss Marple sat in her usual pew, she noticed Mrs. Hartwell across the aisle, her daughter Eleanor beside her. The girl was holding her fraudulent portrait, showing it proudly to other children. Perhaps, Miss Marple thought, there was a lesson in that. Not all deceptions were equal, and not all truths were kind. The skill lay in knowing which to preserve and which to expose, like a photographer choosing which negatives to develop and which to leave in darkness. Dear listeners, that concludes tonight's tale from Velvet Clues. I hope this story of photography and deception has given you something to ponder. Truth, as Miss Marple discovered, isn't always black and white, but rather exists in shades of grey like a vintage photograph. Until next time, I'm Connor, wishing you mysteries to solve and truths to uncover. Good night.